Simon Cowell had never done anything like this before. He stopped the show, put down his microphone, and walked toward the stage with tears in his eyes. The entire theater fell into a silence so deep you could hear the breath of every single person in the room. Producers backstage were frantically signaling, audience members leaned forward in their seats, and the other judges, frozen, watched as Simon broke every protocol he had ever followed. But to understand why this moment shattered Simon Cowell, you have to go back. Back to the moment a 68-year-old blind man named Thomas Walker stepped onto the America's Got Talent stage carrying nothing but a canvas, a brush, and a story that would change everything. Thomas hadn't always been blind. For 50 years, he had been a painter. Not a famous one, not one whose work hung in galleries or museums, but a man who found God in color, who saw the world through the language of light and shadow. He painted sunsets over wheat fields, portraits of his grandchildren, abstracts that captured emotions words couldn't touch. Painting wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. Then, at the age of 65, Thomas was diagnosed with retinal degeneration. The doctors gave him 2 years before his vision would be completely gone. 2 years to see the faces of his family. 2 years to watch the sun rise. 2 years to paint. He spent every single day at his easel. He painted faster than he ever had, as if trying to capture a lifetime in the time he had left. His wife, Margaret, would sit beside him, describing colors when his eyes began to fail him. "The sky is turning violet now, Thomas," she'd whisper. "Like lavender mixed with smoke." But even Margaret's words couldn't stop what was coming. One morning, Thomas woke up and saw nothing. No shapes. No shadows. Just black. For 6 months, he didn't touch a brush. He sat in his studio, surrounded by canvases he could no longer see, and felt like a man whose soul had been taken from him. His hands that had created beauty for half a century, lay useless in his lap. Margaret tried everything. She played music, read him poetry, took him on walks. But nothing brought him back. Until one afternoon, when she placed a brush in his hand and said, "You don't need eyes to feel, Thomas. Paint what you feel." He thought she was crazy. How could a blind man paint? But that night, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He went to his studio, ran his fingers over a blank canvas, and dipped a brush into paint he couldn't see. And then, guided by nothing but memory, instinct, and love, he began to move the brush. What happened next would become the most emotional moment in America's Got Talent history. The producers of AGT received Thomas's audition tape 3 months later. It showed a blind man painting on camera, his hands moving with a strange, almost spiritual confidence. The footage was raw, unpolished, but undeniably powerful. They called him immediately. When Thomas arrived at the theater, the backstage crew wasn't sure what to expect. He walked slowly, guided by his wife, carrying the canvas wrapped in cloth. He refused to let anyone else touch it. "This one's different," he told Margaret. "This one's for her." On stage, under the blinding lights he couldn't see, Thomas stood before Simon Cowell, Heidi Klum, Howie Mandel, and Sofia Vergara. The audience, over 1,000 people, watched in silence. Simon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "So, Thomas," Simon began, his tone measured but not unkind. "Tell us why you're here." Thomas took a breath. His voice was steady, but there was a tremble beneath it. "I'm here because I lost my sight 3 years ago. I was a painter my entire life. When I went blind, I thought that was the end. But my wife, my Margaret, she told me that art doesn't come from the eyes. It comes from somewhere deeper." Simon's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He leaned forward slightly. The audience could sense it too, that rare moment when Simon Cowell, the man who had seen everything, was genuinely curious. "And what are you going to show us today?" Simon asked, his voice measured but with an edge of something unexpected, respect. Thomas smiled, a sad, distant smile that seemed to carry decades of loss and hope intertwined. "I'm going to paint. Live. Right here. And when I'm done, I'll show you what I see when I close my eyes." The judges exchanged glances. Howie looked skeptical, his eyebrows raised in that signature expression of doubt. Sophia's hand moved to her chest, her breath catching. Heidi nodded slowly, intrigued but uncertain. This wasn't just another audition. This was something none of them had prepared for. Simon sat back in his chair, arms still crossed, but his eyes never left Thomas. "You understand," Simon said carefully, "that this stage has seen thousands of artists. Painters, performers, musicians. What makes you think a blind man painting live will be something we haven't seen before?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't cruel, it was honest. And Thomas appreciated that. "Because, Mr. Cowell," Thomas replied, his voice steady, "I'm not here to show you technique. I'm not here to prove I can still do what I used to do. I'm here to show you what happens when everything you thought defined you is taken away, and you find out who you really are." The theater went silent. Even Simon had no response to that. "All right," Simon finally said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "Show us." Thomas walked to the center of the stage where a large canvas had been set up on an easel. He ran his fingers over its edges, feeling the dimensions, tracing the frame like reading Braille. Then, without hesitation, he picked up a brush, dipped it into paint he couldn't see, and began. The first stroke was slow, deliberate. His hand moved across the canvas with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone who couldn't see what he was creating. The audience leaned forward collectively, as if pulled by an invisible thread. Simon's face was unreadable, but his body language told a different story. His arms had uncrossed. His hands were flat on the table. He was no longer the judge, he was a witness. Thomas worked in silence, his breathing steady, his movements fluid. There was something almost meditative about the way he painted. His fingers would occasionally touch the canvas, sensing where the paint had been applied, feeling the texture, the wetness, the dimensions. He was navigating a world the rest of them took for granted. Heidi whispered to Sophia, "This is beautiful." Sophia nodded, unable to speak, tears already forming in her eyes. Minutes passed. The theater remained in that suspended state of collective breath-holding. Thomas added layers, broad strokes first, then finer details. His hands moved with the muscle memory of 50 years, guided by something deeper than sight. It was as if the painting was flowing through him, not from him. Howie, usually the first to crack a joke or break tension, sat perfectly still, his usual energy replaced by something quieter, more profound. Simon hadn't moved. His eyes tracked every motion of Thomas's hands. And for the first time in years, Simon Cowell looked vulnerable. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this performance is still ahead. The audience watched in stunned silence as Thomas's hands continued to move across the canvas. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. His fingers glided over the surface, sensing texture, distance, shape. He worked in layers, broad strokes first, then finer details his hands seemed to remember from another lifetime. Every few moments Thomas would pause, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. Then his hand would move again, adding a shadow here, a highlight there, building something none of them could yet see. The stage lights caught the wet paint, making it shimmer. The colors, deep blues, soft grays, warm golds, began to take form. But the audience couldn't yet tell what they were looking at. It was abstract, emotional, raw. Simon sat completely still, his eyes locked on Thomas. The sarcasm, the biting remarks, the sharp wit that had made him famous, all of it was gone. He was watching something he had never seen before, a man painting with his heart, not his eyes. And it was breaking him. Sophia reached over and touched Heidi's hand. They didn't need words. They both knew they were witnessing something sacred. More minutes passed. The theater was so quiet you could hear the brush bristles moving against canvas, the soft sound of paint being layered, the intake of breath from 1,000 people watching a miracle unfold. Thomas's face remained calm, almost peaceful, as if he were somewhere else entirely, somewhere only he could go. A place where darkness wasn't an absence, but a different kind of light. And then, after what felt like both seconds and hours, he stopped. He stepped back from the canvas, his chest rising and falling, his hands still holding the brush. For a moment, he just stood there, facing the painting he couldn't see, and said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "It's finished." The crew member standing nearby gently turned the canvas around so the judges and audience could see what Thomas had created in his darkness. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The painting showed a woman. She was older, her hair silver, her face lined with age and wisdom. But her eyes were filled with light. The colors were soft, muted, but the emotion was overwhelming. It was a portrait of love, of devotion, of a lifetime spent together. The audience gasped. Several people began to cry. Simon's jaw tightened. He looked down at the table, then back up at the painting. His hands, usually so expressive, so animated, were clenched together. Heidi covered her mouth. Sophia's eyes were wet. Howie stared, speechless. Thomas, standing beside his canvas, unable to see their reactions, asked softly, "Did I do all right?" That's when Simon stood up. He didn't say a word. He just stood, his chair scraping against the floor, the sound echoing through the silent theater. The other judges turned to look at him. The audience held its breath. Simon walked around the judges' table and started toward the stage. The cameras followed him. Producers backstage were gesturing wildly, unsure what was happening. But what happened next, no one in the theater, or watching at home, could ever forget. Simon climbed onto the stage. Thomas heard footsteps and turned slightly, confusion on his face. "Thomas," Simon said, his voice thick with emotion. "That painting, who is she?" Thomas's face softened. "That's my wife, Margaret. She's been my eyes since I lost mine. Every color I paint, every shape I remember, it's because of her. This painting is the way I see her. Not with my eyes. With my heart." Simon looked at the painting again, then back at Thomas. For the first time in the history of America's Got Talent, Simon Cowell's voice cracked. "Thomas, I've been doing this show for over a decade. I've seen thousands of acts. Some made me laugh. Some made me angry. Some were brilliant. But I have never seen anything like what you just did." The audience erupted. People were standing, clapping, crying. But Simon raised his hand, and the theater fell silent again. "You didn't just paint a picture," Simon continued, his eyes glistening. "You painted love. You painted hope. You painted proof that even when life takes something from you, you can still create something beautiful." Thomas's lips trembled. "Thank you," he whispered. Simon turned to look at the other judges. They were all crying now, even Howie. Then Simon looked up toward the production booth, and without asking for permission, without waiting for approval, he walked over to the judges' table. And he slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling. The audience went wild, screaming, cheering, jumping to their feet. The other judges rushed onto the stage. Heidi wrapped her arms around Thomas. Sophia was sobbing. Howie shook his hand, unable to speak. But Simon just stood there, staring at the painting, tears streaming down his face. Later, backstage, after the cameras stopped rolling, Simon found Thomas and Margaret in the green room. Margaret was holding her husband's hand, both of them still in shock. Simon knocked softly on the door. "Can I come in?" Thomas turned toward his voice. "Of course." Simon sat down across from them. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, quietly, he spoke. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. That painting your husband made. I'm going to buy it. I don't care what it costs. I want it in my home. Because every time I look at it, I want to remember what Thomas taught me tonight." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "What did he teach you?" Simon smiled, a real smile, not the smirk he usually wore. "That the greatest art doesn't come from talent. It comes from love." Thomas reached out his hand, and Simon took it. "Thank you," Thomas said. "Not just for the golden buzzer. For seeing what I couldn't." Simon's voice was barely a whisper. "No, Thomas. Thank you for showing me what I'd been blind to." Share and subscribe, so this story will never be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Thomas Walker's audition became the most watched moment in AGT history. It was shared millions of times. News outlets covered it. People from around the world sent letters, paintings, and messages of hope. But for Simon Cowell, it was more than just a viral moment. It was a turning point. From that day forward, he approached every audition differently. He listened more. He felt more. He remembered that behind every act, there was a human story, and sometimes those stories were more powerful than any performance. Years later, in an interview, Simon was asked about the moment that changed him. "It was Thomas," he said without hesitation. "A blind man taught me how to see. And I'll never forget him." The painting still hangs in Simon's home. And every time he passes it, he stops. He looks at the woman with the silver hair, and the eyes filled with light. And he remembers the lesson a blind painter taught him on a stage in front of 1,000 people. That true vision comes from the heart. And love is the only thing worth painting.